Disruption feels like destruction, a collapse, breakdown. Something ends, and we panic. But what if disruption isn't the opposite of order? What if it's how the universe renews itself? We live in a moment obsessed with stability. We try to stop disruption, control it. And when that fails, we often co-opt it, weaponize it, use it for power rather than understanding it as a process. Today we explore disruption as a natural cycle of the universe, one we fear, misunderstand, and resist, even as it quietly shapes everything from ecosystems to identities, organizations, civilizations. Disruption isn't random. It's a fractal breakpoint, the moment when an existing pattern can no longer sustain itself. The form still exists, but the conditions that once supported it don't. At that point, reality does one of two things. It reorganizes or it collapses. Disruption is the moment in between. In nature, forest fires are terrifying, but they're also part of a living system. They clear dead matter, release nutrients locked in old forms, make space for regeneration. Suppress fire too long and the forest doesn't become safer, it becomes more fragile. And when fire finally comes, it's catastrophic. This pattern, disruption and renewal, repeats everywhere. Disruption isn't chaos. It's a transition. In non-linear systems, change isn't always gradual. It's threshold-based. We see this in nature. Water doesn't slowly become steam. It hits a limit, then flips state. Life evolves the same way. Extinctions, mutations, environmental shocks. Biology advances by being forced out of equilibrium. Without periodic disturbance, systems don't remain healthy. They stagnate. Psychological disruption often happens when identity patterns can't metabolize reality anymore. Burnout, breakdowns, anxiety spikes, depression. These can be signals of misfit, not weakness. The psyche resists disruption because it feels like annihilation. The ego confuses pattern loss with death, even when change would be adaptive. A common misinterpretation would be, well, something's wrong with me, when actually a more accurate frame might be, an outdated structure can't accommodate who I am anymore. But here's the critical part. Disruption, when it's too fast, unsupported, unnamed, denied meaning, or unintegrated, becomes traumatic. Philosophers saw this long before modern science. Heraclides noticed that what looked like stability was really slow change. What lasts isn't form, but flow. The Stoics made this practical. They saw that bodies fail, empires fall, fortunes reverse. Disruption isn't an exception, it's the rule. Stoics compared change to fire or winter. Destructive in appearance, reorganizing in fact. Tension breaks old forms. What remains reorganizes. Something new emerges. The same pattern again and again. History also unfolds through rupture. Civilizations don't evolve by smooth accumulation. They reorganize through revolutions, collapses, renaissances. From a pattern perspective, disruption marks the point where an old structure exhausts its capacity to sustain complexity. Empires often collapse when they suppress disruption too long. Delayed disruption increases brittleness, guaranteeing more violent reorganizations later. When we look closely, we see that history doesn't move in a straight line. It rises and falls, repeating similar patterns in people, organizations, and entire civilizations. The pattern's the same. What changes is the magnitude. Like the Stoics, many traditions see disruption as natural and seasonal. Fields rest before renewal. Night comes before morning. Decay precedes renewal. Death before rebirth, or descent before ascent. Indigenous wisdom begins with impermanence. Rivers move, life adapts, or it ends. Buddhism teaches that suffering doesn't come from change, but from clinging to what cannot last. From this lens, disruption isn't the enemy. It's how life renews itself, by breaking old forms so something true can appear again. At the personal level, disruption feels like failure, burnout, illness, loss of identity. You find yourself in a life that suddenly no longer fits. It's terrifying. Some call this the dark night of the soul. But often what's happening isn't annihilation, it's reconfiguration. A pattern you've outgrown can't hold anymore, so the system forces a reset. If we hide in our fear of the unknown, if we run from unpleasant sensations, we can suffer unnecessarily during what is actually a transformative process. I'm a recovered people pleaser. I use that phrase the same way people in AA talk about being recovered alcoholics. Recovered doesn't mean cured. It means aware. It means something I work with every single day. I can't tell you exactly when I became a people pleaser. It's one of those patterns that forms early, through relationships with parents, teachers, authority figures. I was agreeable, grateful, accommodating. I was the person who would help people move, pick them up at the airport. I paid one boyfriend's child support for months. I was the sturdy shoulder for my aunt's relationship problems, a teacher grieving her father's death, a best friend struggling with her stepmother. I was also the place where anger and rage were frequently deposited. What was missing from most of these relationships was me. My thoughts, my feelings, my needs. It took me many years to realize this wasn't what healthy relationships were supposed to look like. For a long time, I told myself I was a great friend. My martyrdom gave me a sense of moral worth. There was a quiet belief underneath that life was a test, and someday all these people would wake up and recognize how much I'd given and feel compelled to give something back. I clung to people pleasing because it was my only hope of getting emotionally unavailable people to give me what they were never capable of offering. I built my identity around this. It fueled the perfectionism that defined my career, working nights and weekends, completing projects without being asked, operating at a level higher than my bosses expected. Not as a power play, but as a desperate attempt to be seen, to be valued, to be loved. This isn't a life, it's servitude to a cruel and distant master inside your own head. That master is built from the scraps of incomplete relationships. For me, it led to years of burnout, anxiety, depression, and despite all that people-pleasing, ongoing relationship problems. The cycle was always the same. Long stretches of overgiving, followed by exhaustion or anger when it went unnoticed. Then withdrawal, shutting down, sometimes cutting people off entirely. And then, inevitably, the pattern would repeat. The disruption that changed my life didn't arrive as a single dramatic event. It came slowly, as a sensation in my body. I was done. Just done. If you've ever felt that, you know what I mean. It's not explosive, it's quiet. It's a firm resignation, a knowing that something cannot be undone. It feels a little bit like that final stage of grief, when the mind stops fighting, when sadness floods in, like drowning, but without the struggle to stay afloat. I remember one early spring day sitting outside wrapped in a blanket, listening to Vivaldi's Four Seasons on repeat, watching birds fly back and forth to a feeder in my yard. Part of me wondered if I'd ever move again. I felt broken. The momentum that had carried me for decades was gone. And part of me was relieved. Personal transformation has an in-between phase, a space between who you were and who you're becoming. It's painful and disorienting. Your old life no longer fits, but the new one hasn't arrived yet. Yeah, this phase lasted for some years for me. It felt like walking through a tunnel so long you forgot where you were, until suddenly light appears. I had told myself stories about how things should go. None of them came true, of course. That was just another attempt to control the process instead of letting it unfold. What surprised me most was how gentle the after felt. I didn't emerge harder. I didn't need the brutal momentum or sharp self-discipline I'd relied on before. I realized that pleasing myself was the point. It sounds simple, almost embarrassingly so, but it meant turning inward, befriending what was inside of me, learning to listen for what I needed first. It wasn't selfishness, it was self-compassion. And from there, something unexpected happened. When I began with self-love, I had far more to give, freely, without depletion. The version of me that emerged was softer and far more powerful than I ever imagined. In the end, I found the process revealed less about me giving too much to others, as it was about me needing to reconnect with the parts of myself I had abandoned entirely. We can see these same patterns of disruption play out in relationships too. Rupture isn't the exception, it's part of the cycle. Conflict surfaces what can't remain hidden. Repair determines whether something evolves or ends. Avoiding disruption doesn't create harmony. It often creates resentment. As we explored in our episode on polarity and emergence, when tension is denied or suppressed, it doesn't disappear. It builds. And when rupture arrives without containment or repair, it can fracture the delicate bonds relationships depend on. Seen this way, rupture isn't relational failure, it's relational data. Healthy systems move through cycles of rupture, repair, and renegotiation. Healthy relationships don't avoid disruption, they metabolize it. They change, they adapt, and yes, they can even grow because of it. I individually coach a man and a woman who have been married over 20 years. She's a lawyer and he's a teacher. At some point in my work with them, something surprising emerged. In all those years of marriage, they had never fought. Not once. No arguments, no major conflicts. The last fight they could recall was when they first got together and she had given him an ultimatum to marry her. For years, they considered themselves an ideal couple. They felt bad for friends and family who reported having frequent arguments, separations, even divorce. The husband told me that for a long time, he'd considered writing a book on relationships. He genuinely believed they had cracked the code on having the perfect marriage. They came to me when both of their teenage daughters left home to attend college abroad. With the children gone, something shifted. Their large colonial house fell quiet for the first time in years. There was no one there to supervise, protect, or worry about. They had done their job as parents and raised two capable young women. And in the absence of that shared responsibility, something unsettling surfaced. They no longer knew each other. We tend to assume relationships end in explosive conflict, arguments about money, lifestyle, betrayal, but sometimes disruption comes not from chaos, but from stillness. The woman described the moment to me. She said they were having dinner alone at a restaurant in London on the last night of a trip to visit their eldest daughter. They had just ordered. The waiter took their menus. And then it happened. Nothing. She looked across the table at her husband and felt as though she didn't know who he was. There was nothing to say. Every topic about the girls had been exhausted. It was just the two of them. And suddenly she felt overwhelming terror, realizing she no longer knew how to live with him alone. That terror was the moment of revelation, the instant she became conscious that the structure of their relationship could no longer hold. Even if she wanted to avoid disruption, it already happened. The form they had relied on had grown brittle and quietly collapsed. Over time, both came to see that their lack of conflict hadn't been a gift. It was a sign of avoidance, of performance, of emotional stagnation. They had grown and evolved professionally. They had grown as parents. But within the relationship, nothing had moved. For decades, they went through the motions. Is it any wonder they woke up one day and saw each other as strangers? I'm still working with this couple. It's not yet clear whether they'll stay together or separate. The process is painful and disorienting, but necessary. Whatever the outcome, I'm confident they'll both be happier in the long run. Organizations experience disruption as reorgs, layoffs, leadership changes, moments when what once felt solid suddenly doesn't. A strategy that worked for years stops working. Teams are reshuffled, decisions stall. People feel it before it's ever named. At first, we call these moments failures, but inside most organizations, the story is more familiar than that. People sense the strain long before anything breaks. Workarounds multiply, values get bent to meet impossible targets. The system keeps asking more from people than it was ever designed to hold. That's when disruption arrives, not as a surprise, but as a reckoning. The danger isn't disruption itself. The danger is pretending nothing has changed. When organizations deny what's no longer working, disruption turns extractive and dehumanizing. Rushed decisions, power plays, losses that go unacknowledged. Sometimes disruption is met with an uninspired reflex to retreat to a previous state or to swing hard toward its opposite. We explored this pattern in our episode on polarity. But when disruption is faced honestly, it can become something else. A moment to grieve what's ending, to preserve dignity, and to deliberately shape what comes next. At the societal level, disruption feels existential. AI shocks, economic volatility, energy transitions, political instability. We argue about whether disruption is good or bad, even though our nervous systems are telling us something completely different. The truth is, disruption itself is neutral. The question isn't how do we stop disruption? It's how do we navigate it wisely? It's important to say this plainly. Disruption itself isn't always the danger, but disruption can become dangerous when it overwhelms us, or when it's denied, or when it's deliberately manipulated. The first thing we need to think about is that as humans, we have limits as to how much change we can absorb at once. When disruption moves faster than our ability to make sense of it, it doesn't lead to growth, it leads to trauma. This is true for individuals and for groups. In childhood, for example, trauma isn't defined by how objectively bad something was. It's defined by whether the child had the capacity, support, and safety to understand what was happening. When experience exceeds our ability to integrate it, the nervous system goes into survival mode. The same principle applies at larger scales. Climate change is a clear example of how disruption becomes distorted in two ways at once. For decades, scientists have warned about what's coming. Not just extreme weather or rising temperatures, but the cascading effects on food systems, migration, economies, and social stability. The signal has been clear. But instead of adapting steadily, we've oscillated between denial and panic. When disruption is denied long enough, it doesn't disappear, it compounds. And when it finally breaks through, it does so with far greater force. There's a third distortion as well: when disruption is weaponized. When fear is amplified, when complexity is flattened into enemies and sides, when uncertainty is exploited for power, our collective ability to respond wisely is impaired. Attention fractures, trust erodes, coordination collapses. In those conditions, disruption stops being a teacher and becomes a threat. Disruption isn't psychological, it's not political, it's not ideological. It's the circuitry of reality itself, the operating system beneath the surface, the code that runs the world. It's how systems reorganize when conditions change. And wherever you look, nature, minds, markets, cultures, the same pattern appears. Stability held too long becomes brittle. Disruption unleashed too fast becomes chaos. Life doesn't choose between them. It lives in the tension. And that tension isn't a flaw. It's the engine of the world. So how do we work with disruption rather than against it? Not by mastering it, but by changing our relationship to it. I offer 3 practices which you might find useful. These aren't techniques to master disruption, they're ways to develop a different relationship with it. First, name the pattern before judging the event. When you're dealing with disruption, don't start by thinking about what's broken or flawed. Ask, what kind of disruption is this? Regenerative, extractive, delayed? Then ask, what's reached its limit? Maybe a job that fit 5 years ago doesn't fit who you've become, or a relationship that worked when you were younger needs to evolve for the next chapter of your life. Reframing from broken to complete changes everything. Some things end not because they failed, but because they've succeeded and then exceeded the conditions they were designed for. Plainly speaking, it's not working anymore because it's completed its purpose. 2, separate grief from fear. Grief honors what's ending. Fear imagines annihilation that may not be coming. Name which one you're in because they require different care. Rituals, pauses, honest conversations, spaces and people where disruption can be processed rather than explode. And here's the hardest truth. When you're inside disruption, you can't see what's coming. You can only feel the breaking. But the pattern is real, even when your experience of it is chaos. Every collapse is followed by reorganization. Maybe not always in the form you expect or wish, maybe not always on your timeline. But the goal isn't certainty. It's developing stability around the change so you don't fall apart while it unfolds. 3, build containers for change. Suppression breeds catastrophe, but chaos isn't the only alternative. Create containers that let disruption unfold at a pace you can integrate. Rituals, pauses, honest conversations, support systems. You don't have to see the outcome to cooperate with the process, but you do have to stay present long enough to let the next form emerge. Disruption isn't an enemy. It's how reality learns. When you see disruption as a pattern rather than a punishment, the world stops looking chaotic. You begin to notice the signal inside the noise, the beginning inside the ending. As technology accelerates the pace of our lives, we lose precious time trying to predict or, worse, control what's changing. Fear pulls our attention towards certainty instead of understanding. Wisdom invites a different response, not to stop the disruption, but to integrate it, not to cling to what's breaking, but to adapt with intention. And in that process, something falls away, something that no longer fits. The old, smaller version of ourselves loosens its grip and makes room for what comes next. I'm Mary Schaub. This is Fractals of Change. Until next time, wishing you curiosity, presence, and flow.